Hello, I am Manueltus, and today I'm going to be talking about a subject that I may have been teasing for quite some time, but I decidedly. Oops, sorry. I already messed up. No, I finally decided to actually talk about it. And that's, of course, Star Trek versus Star Wars. So today I'm not actually going to give any conclusive definitions on certain issues, since I think they are best analyzed individually, since there's such a wide array of issues that I believe it is important to establish a good degree of knowledge over each individual subject before attempting to fully define the whole. But what I'm doing today is more laying the ground rules and offering some basic considerations for any Star Trek versus Star Wars scenario. So, of course, there are different types of comparisons, and the type I'm specifically talking about are types related to power scaling and dimensional tiering, although dimensional tiering is probably not going to play as a role in this as it might be in some other scenarios, because Star Wars and Star Trek don't really have too many characters in them that really defy the dimensions in any traditional way. Now, of course, I'm not saying that there aren't any. I'm just saying that they're not common and they're generally not the main characters. So another thing to take into account is that, of course, there's different types of scaling that you can do. As I mentioned earlier, you can scale individual characters, you can scale large states, such as, for example, the Federation against the Empire, or perhaps the Borg Collective, or the Rebel Alliance. All sorts of different states that you can have fight each other, or organizations. And of course, another popular one is the idea of comparing spaceships. I think that's probably one of the most popular aspects of comparison that I've seen. A lot of talk about technology goes into that, so that's always an important consideration to make. Now, of course, when it comes to the strength of individuals, in Star Wars, there's a lot of individuals who have, or a lot of important individuals who have force powers. Now, of course, there also are a lot that don't, but we don't see a similar degree of superpowered individuals as frequent main characters in Star Trek. And that's assuming that you're, of course, excluding characters that have telepathy, since they are actually a bit more common than some people think they are. However, usually it isn't too strong a telepathic power, so I don't think it would be too much of a big deal in a fight, particularly in this specific scenario. Now, of course, that being said, there are also characters on both sides that far exceed the norm of how strong characters are. One big example on the Star Trek side, of course, would be Q, who has power that some might say is probably multidimensional, and therefore is, of course, above the power of most characters in Star Trek, as well as most characters in Star Wars. Now, that being said, there also are other characters in Star Trek that have some sort of godlike power or seemingly omnipotent power. It seems to be a common trope in Star Trek, a common plot device, anyway. Another thing to take into account is, of course, the effect of personal weapons and military tactics. Of course, in Star Wars, what I see is that military tactics generally are more fleshed out than they are in Star Trek. And that, of course, lends itself to Star Wars generally having an advantage in that aspect. Now, of course, that's mostly talking about ground tactics. In space combat, it's a bit different because in Star Trek, there's also quite a bit of space combat scenes as well, so there certainly is a degree of fleshing out. Now, another thing to remember is the idea of plot convenience and characters overcoming certain odds due to certain plot conveniences, which of course does not really measure into general power scaling. For example, saying that the Enterprise crew defeated the Borg on multiple occasions, or that the Voyager crew defeated the Borg on multiple occasions when it comes to Star Trek, doesn't mean that they're more powerful than the average Borg cube, except for in the episode Endgame, of course, because that's a special situation. However, that being said, the Borg are generally more powerful than most Federation starships that they encounter. And the same thing in Star Wars when it comes to the Death Star. The Rebel Alliance attacking this Death Star is usually portrayed to not be as strong as the Death Star and its supporting fleet. And, of course, they win the day by exploiting the weaknesses of the Death Star, which, especially when you're thinking about the first movie, are not necessarily known to everyone. Not everybody knows that there's the exhaust port, and that's in fact the information that they went through great trouble to steal and to send to the Rebel Alliance so that they know of that weakness, because otherwise they would not have had much confidence in being able to defeat the Death Star, especially with having the disadvantage in overall military numbers, and of course having to wage an asymmetrical conflict in order to even stand a chance at beating the Empire. Because of course, what's dangerous about Darth Vader and the Emperor isn't just that they have force powers from the dark side that they use in a very sinister manner. It's actually that they have a whole empire behind them, supporting them in their evil deeds. And that's really a big thing to take into account. And of course, if you're doing a battle between individuals, that is something that you may say, would they have support or would they not have support? That's another consideration to make. Now, of course, another big thing is space travel. Now, when it comes to interstellar travel, I do believe that on average, Star Wars will have the advantage because they are mildly intergalactic in the sense that it's the galaxy, as it is called, and some minor galaxies that are close by to it, but generally speaking, they're not on a high level of intergalactic where they go to throughout the whole galactic cluster or something like that. That's generally not what happens in the show. Now, of course, in the expanded universe, you may see some of that, but that's generally not as common in the main body of canon. And similarly with Star Trek, they are actually not intergalactic, at least not in any regular basis or any regular capability of achieving it. In fact, compared to the extent of the galaxy that the Federation has access to, when you compare that to the Empire, the Federation's influence is significantly smaller, and that's due to the fact that warp travel, even at warp 9 points, whatever they get up to, is generally not as fast as Star Wars' hyperspace. Now, of course, there are arguments to make about maybe early hyperspace being a bit slower and all of that, but that's an entirely different topic. So generally speaking, interstellar travel in Star Wars is going to be faster. Now, of course, if you're talking about the Borg, you have the ability to skip a bit of that with transwarp, which of course makes it significantly faster. But generally speaking, when you're talking about the speed of interstellar travel, you also end up having to talk about logistics, because if you take that speed into account and you assume that whichever area the conflict would occur in would have been charted for hyperspace lanes by the Empire, then you would, of course, have a reasonable strength in assuming that the Empire would have a significant advantage in logistics, in being able to respond to crises. They would be able to do that a lot faster. They would be able to attack and retreat in a manner that the Federation simply would not be able to counteract because of the much slower space travel. Because if you think about it, the Federation can't really go on an offensive effectively, because while their spaceships are en route, the Empire can simply go behind them and attack their space docks and all the infrastructure that Starfleet has can be destroyed without Starfleet being able to send a fleet to counterattack. And once the infrastructure is down, then the starships can't get good maintenance. Well, they still can to some extent, because Voyager as a series does exist. But generally speaking, when you're talking about waging a full-scale war, that's not going to be possible. So that is, I believe, a very important consideration to make. And it is something that does not take into account the actual strength of weapons, because that's not necessarily a factor here. Now, of course, Starfleet does have defensive installations at certain positions, so that is another thing to take into account. But weapons isn't what I'm talking about today. Now, of course, when talking about warp, you also have the situation where in Star Trek it's possible to fire torpedoes from warp speed, which could actually give a significant tactical advantage in a space battle. However, this is not a commonly used technique in Star Trek. Although it is well established canonically, it is not commonly used. So take that with a grain of salt on whether or not it should be taken into account in any potential battle. Now, as some of you may have guessed, I am more of an expert on Star Trek than I am on Star Wars. Now, I've seen all the Star Wars movies, and I've read some of the expanded universe stuff, so I have a general knowledge, but of course I would be relying on a lot of articles that have been written about it. I've read tons of different articles by people on both sides of the camp as to who would win in each different category. So I, of course, will be looking at those and maybe thinking about whether that's accurate or inaccurate, or whether I have an entirely different position than either side has. For example, one position that I have that I don't think is too common out there is about the use of asteroid destroying as a feat. And the reason I think that that is not a valid feat, especially when we're talking about Star Trek, and to a lesser extent when we're talking about Star Wars, is because in both universes there exist elements that generally don't exist in our real-life universe. And therefore, it follows that there may be some unusual elements present in asteroids. Now, of course, in Star Trek, you've got about half a dozen different events where that is actually the case, where maybe there's a strange composition for an asteroid, or, oh wait, there's an entire civilization inside of this one, or for some reason we can't move the asteroid as we want to because it has a strange composition, and all sorts of different storylines about there's something wrong with this asteroid. Well, that's probably usually not the center point of the story. There's usually another story going on. However, it is plot important in several episodes of Star Trek, both in the Next Generation as well as Voyager and the original series, that asteroids have sometimes unpredictable qualities that, of course, when we're doing power scaling, means that it is generally not a measurable feat to see which asteroids are destroyed and how large they are, because we might not know the actual composition of the asteroid. And it is true to some extent in real life as well, because you take spectrometers and you measure the chemical compositions of various star systems, and you might realize that, of course, they have different chemical compositions. And if a star is of a different chemical composition, it could also mean that asteroids in the system might have a different chemical composition as well, because we might not have the same asteroids that we have in our solar system, and they might be very different in how they formed, where they're coming from. Maybe they've been tampered with by someone. And all those factors, in my opinion, is why I do not consider asteroid-destroying calculations to be valid unless we know the actual composition of the asteroid and its density, and are therefore able to make an accurate calculation. Because if we don't know what the asteroid's made of or how dense it is, then how could we possibly know the difference between igniting a stick of wood and a stick of dynamite? Because that could essentially be a valid comparison here, because what if the asteroid is composed of an explosive substance? You don't know that. Maybe it might be. So maybe you should always do due diligence and see what it's made of first. So I don't want to go too far on this asteroid tirade. It's probably maybe the third or fourth time I've done it when talking about power scaling and science fiction. But I do believe it is something worth mentioning, and that's why I mentioned it. So what are some other important aspects when comparing Star Trek and Star Wars in a power scaling sense, not in a production value and which one's more popular and all that? That's an entirely different conversation for another time. Although I am willing to have that conversation, I do believe it is a valid conversation, and it is a conversation that I'm willing and eager to have. However, that's not what this video is about. So what are some other aspects that you might take into account when doing power scaling between Star Trek and Star Wars? Are there some websites that you would recommend? Are there some calcs that you have made that you believe would be very useful for this? I just want to get some viewer interaction going, and we'll see what happens there. So thank you all for watching. I've been Anawiltus, and I will be seeing you all next time. Anawiltus over and out.